Hello everybody, and welcome back to another video. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the 2024 presidential election, but talking about a new scenario today. I will do the same thing for Donald Trump in the coming days, but today we'll be focusing on the best case scenario for Kamala Harris. Realistically, what is her best case scenario? If everything goes right for her between now and election day, what would the electoral map look like? So we're going to get right into it here. We're going to talk about the polls. We're going to talk about some possible outcomes, talk about the results from 2020, and kind of look at them in a way that's favorable to Kamala Harris. In other words, everything that could go right for her does go right for her. What would the map look like? So we're going to start out by filling out the states that she's going to win. And these are states that she'd already be winning regardless of whether or not this is like a best case scenario type of outcome. But what we're going to see here is that for the most part, the states are going to stay the same. I think that she has 226 electoral votes in this scenario that she would probably be locking down. And then Trump, he'd still hold on to a good number of states. Obviously, in a best case scenario, his margin, or in a Harris best case scenario, his margins would kind of fall a bit, but he'd still start with 80 electoral votes in the safe column. Now, before we get into the swing states here, or the even states that are remotely competitive, we have to talk about the national polling. And right now, Kamala Harris is up by 3.4% nationally, which is a step down from Biden's 2020 margin of about 4.5%. Now, getting into the polls is kind of going to open a whole nother can of worms. I don't want to do that today, but broadly, my thoughts are if there is a polling miss, it's equally likely to be in the direction of the Democrats or Kamala Harris as it is to be in the direction of Trump or the Republican Party. And that wasn't true in 2016 or 2020, both elections. And if you watch me in 2020, you'll know that I predicted there was going to be a polling miss that benefited Trump, which is why I didn't have Biden winning Florida. I didn't have Biden winning North Carolina. I didn't have it particularly close in Texas or Ohio or Iowa. But the reason that a polling miss is a lot less likely this time is because the polls actually coincide with what we're seeing on the ground. Whereas in 2020, on the ground and in special elections and in turnout data we were getting, it was looking like a close election, but the polls had it as a not a very close election. This time, the polls and the special elections and the data we have on the ground with, for example, mail-in ballot requests in states like Pennsylvania, we know that it points to a slightly Democratic-leaning environment. So it all kind of aligns with the same outcome. Now, let's just say that we do see a slight polling miss that benefits Harris. Maybe she wins by 5 or 6 nationally instead of 3.5. And again, we have seen polling that would predict this. Big Village has her up by 7. She's up in YouGov by a couple of points. She was up in FAU and Morning Consult by 4 and 5. So there have been polls that have showed her winning. And broadly, she's doing very well nationally. In the past few days, she hasn't trailed in a national poll. So again, perhaps there would be a polling miss. Any best case scenario, there would be, and it would favor her. So again, to start out in states that she'd probably win by maybe 5, 6, 7 points, I would argue that you could put potentially Michigan in there, because right now in Michigan, she's holding up pretty well. If you take a look at the polling data we have at the moment, she's up by 3. So if there was a polling miss there, similar to the one we had in 2020, she'd win by 5 or 6. Arizona, I'm tempted to put there just because in a best case scenario for Democrats, maybe Ruben Gallego beats Kari Lake by 8 or 9. Obviously, I don't think that's going to happen, but this is a best case scenario. And if that were to happen, Kamala Harris could maybe win by 4 or 5. But that's all I'm comfortable with putting in the likely Democratic column. Now, for the likely Republican states, we're going to kind of fill out the rest of the map for Trump here. He'd still win Montana, Utah. He'd still win Kansas. He'd still win Nebraska's first district. He would still win Missouri, Mississippi, South Carolina, as well as Iowa. But again, that only gets him to 128. So we've given him the other more Republican-leaning states, and he's still not close to a victory here. So next up, the more competitive states that Harris would win by maybe 2, 3, 4, maybe lower end of 5. I could definitely see Wisconsin in that column. Same thing with Pennsylvania. And again, both these states were broadly better for Democrats than a lot of people expected. Democrats swept Pennsylvania in 2022. They even won back the state house. In Wisconsin, they won the governorship and the majority of down ballot offices, but they didn't win the competitive House seat and they didn't win a Senate race. But again, in both those races, they came closer than a lot of people expected. And so again, historically, the polls, especially in Wisconsin, have actually underestimated Republicans. But in 2022, it was the opposite. And the polls here are pretty good for Kamala Harris. Right now, again, she's up by 3%. And this comes after we've kind of gotten some GOP favorable polls. And even Fabrizio, which is Donald Trump's pollster, has her up by 4, which is a very good outcome for her if she won it by 4, let alone the fact that it's from Donald Trump's pollster. So all in all, I could see the case for Harris in on a good night winning Wisconsin or Pennsylvania by 4, maybe 5 points. The polls in Wisconsin have been good for her. Pennsylvania, they've been within a 2-point race, which is less good for her, but still, in 2022, never forget, Democrats were trailing in that Senate race in the polls in the final days of the campaign, and they won. It wasn't very close either. So we're now going to go over to. And by the way, I'm just going to put Nevada and Georgia in here. They're in a different tier. I think these states are close to likely. These states are actually firmly closer to lean or toss up. But Nevada, again, Senate polls, if you take a look at the Senate polls in Nevada, just to kind of show you right now, because again, the reverse coattails don't really exist. Usually, if a candidate gets carried, it's by the person at the presidential level, not at the Senate level. But if we look at Nevada, if I can find it, wow. Like the latest polls, Democrats up by 11, 14, 9, 11, 4, 12, 3, 18, 5, 4, 2, 8, 12. So it's really good for Democrats in that Senate race. In the presidential election, it's pretty close, but Harris has an advantage. And again, historically in Nevada, polls do underestimate Democrats. So, you can really make the case for anything happening. But maybe Harris on a good night wins Nevada by 3 or 4. Georgia's similar. It's a left-trending state. And in 2020, again, if we just look at the counties where the majority of the population is, just to look briefly at the geography here, you look at North Atlanta. These are counties that have massive population. If these counties even swing to Kamala Harris in 50% as strongly as they swung to Joe Biden, she could win the state by 2 or 3, if not more than that. Again, I'm not predicting that, but on a good night, maybe there's some more backlash for Republicans from the Dobbs decision. Suburban voters are more upset with Trump than we think they are. That could all contribute to a good night in Georgia for Kamala Harris. Now, for the lean Republican states, I'm going to give Trump a couple here. I think the first would be Ohio. This state I'm putting in lean barely, still could be likely, but I'm putting it in lean just because, again, if we see Republican turnout in the rural areas depressed, while we see Democratic turnout in areas like Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, Toledo rise the way some people are hoping it could, then in theory it could be within 5 points, but Kamala Harris still really wouldn't come close here. It's just kind of worth talking about. Alaska's more interesting to me because there's a wider range of outcomes. I still don't think Kamala Harris is likely to win it, but it's been trending left for a while. Biden did 5.5 points better there than Hillary Clinton. On a good night, maybe Harris repeats that swing and loses it by 4 points. And then the final one's going to be Maine 2nd District. This one you could put in tilt. We actually had a poll that had Harris up by 5 here, but in 2020 there was a huge polling miss here, and the polls in Maine just broadly have not been good, for a very long time. In 2022, they were pretty wrong with the governor's race. They showed a pretty close race, and Democrats won by 13. And then in 2020, obviously, I think the most infamous polling miss, perhaps in the history of U.S. Senate races, was when Susan Collins was down by 9 points on Election Day and won by 8. So we had a 17-point polling miss in Maine. Not a huge fan of the polls here. I know a lot of people are hopeful for Kamala Harris in that district. Maybe on a good night she'd come close to winning it, but I still could not see her winning it. So yeah. Now, the final states we're going to talk about here in the Sun Belt, North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. To me, the easiest one is North Carolina. This one's borderline lean, but I'm just going to put it in the tilt out of an abundance of caution. Kamala Harris, to me, can definitely win here, and on a good night, she absolutely would. If we take a look at the polls, she's only down by 0.5 point. And again, she's been pretty close in most polling. Again, this poll is run by a right-wing Twitter account, so I don't usually factor that in my predictions, but Emerson only had her down by 1. She's only down by 1 in Fox News. She was tied in the Survey USA poll and then up by 1 when they didn't push undecided voters. Then Focal Data, she was up by, in their likely voter screen, she was up by 1. She was up by more in their other screens. So again, she has momentum here. I've heard a lot of good things for Democrats on the ground in North Carolina. You also have to remember that in the governor's race, it looks very likely Josh Stein's going to win. Not a done deal by any means, but just kind of show you all the polling here. Robinson hasn't led in a poll in months. He's down by 6, 10, 11, 8, 14, 6, 10, 10, 10, 4, 5, 4. So, and he's losing momentum pretty quickly. And again, even Republican-aligned pollsters are, showing Stein up by 10. So, again, I don't really believe in reverse coattails. I don't think that a governor's race can cost someone the presidential race. I think it could be the other way around. I think a presidential race can affect the governor's race. But again, just the fact that Republicans seem to be polling pretty poorly all across the board here, to me, indicates that there are problems that they have in this state. Now, to kind of take a look at Texas, or actually, we'll go to Florida first. Florida, I still don't think would necessarily flip back to the Democrats. I think Harris loses by maybe 2 points. And Obviously, we've gotten a couple of close polls, but even still, in Florida, polls have historically always underestimated Republicans, and that remained true in 2022. And again, right now, take a look at the polls. Trump's still up by 4. So there'd have to be a pretty weird polling miss in Florida to even have be within 2 points. And it's a right trending state. Every election there since 2020 has been very bad for the Democrats. They haven't won a statewide race here since 2018. They haven't won a federal race statewide here since 2012. So even on a good night for Kamala Harris, I still don't think she wins Florida back for the Democrats. Again, the state, I think long term is going to be very hard for Democrats to come back to winning. So now the final state's going to be Texas. This one's to me the closest, but I think on a very good night, Kamala Harris would win it by like maybe 0.5, if that. Again, it would be very close, and this is an absolute best case scenario. So certainly this isn't like my prediction. I don't really think she has a very good chance of winning Texas. But again, some of the better polls you've gotten out of the state have it relatively close. I mean, the Hobby School of Public Affairs had it under 5-point margin of victory for Trump. In 2020, Trump won it by 5.6, and then obviously in 2016 he won it by 10. So like if that swing repeated again, you'd see a 1-point victory for Trump, and at that point it could be anyone's game. I'm not predicting Texas actually will flip, by the way. I'm just saying, like, in theory, the trends are there for Democrats. The polls have been kind of close, even though we don't have a ton. And just broadly in this state, there are a lot of wealthy, Republican-leaning suburban voters who probably aren't happy with the Dobbs decision, who probably are more socially liberal, who in the past have voted Republican. But if there's actually like a genuine wave of anti-Trump feeling throughout the suburbs, the way this is something that the polls aren't picking up on, then it would probably manifest in Texas better than almost anywhere else. So again, this is the absolute best case scenario for Kamala Harris. This is not my prediction, but this is what would happen on a good night for her. She'd probably do very well in the Midwest, hold on to narrow Biden states like Arizona, Nevada, and Georgia, and then kind of expand the map into states like Texas and North Carolina. So let me know what you think. Let me know if there's any other states you think would flip blue in a best case scenario for Harris. But and also, by the way, feel free to suggest videos down below. I'm always happy to do them. So again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all in tomorrow's video.